As time passes, we love to look back and categorize times that share a similar through line as eras. In the world of video games, this is made especially easy by PlayStation and Xbox releasing their big consoles simultaneously. Typically containing similar hardware and advancements, the consoles also share plenty of titles from a plethora of publishers. No generation of consoles interests me more than the span of the 7th generation, and for more reasons than you may think. Yes, it is the generation I grew up in, when I truly slapped on my skimpies and dove headfirst into the world of gaming, and came out the other side as the fanatical freak you know and tolerate today. Though I also find it so fascinating due to the fact that while it was one of the shortest generations, it was one of the most strangely influential. With incredibly high highs and terrifyingly tumultuous lows, the 7th generation influenced the way games are made to this day for better or worse. A generation of consoles containing hardware with more capability than developers knew what to do with. Video games were now able to enter a stride hitherto unseen. If you were a first-person shooter fan, your plate would be overflowing with a multitude of options. Third-person shooters found themselves introduced to the innovation of cover shooters. Story-based games found themselves in the infinite grasp of Telltale and companies similar. Meanwhile, some games were conquering the gaming space by blending genres together into deliciously overspiced gumbo pots of entertainment. Truly, it seems like video games were on the up and up. Everyone was eating well, but then that golden era began to fade away. Amongst the genres, however, few seem to suffer quite as dearly as the topic of today's discussion. For the multiple failures of multiple companies opened the eyes of many. Just when gaming was about to hit an all-time high, hubris struck. And one of the many genres that suffered dearly was that of beloved horror games. And while it may be unfair to focus on one tiny era of a generation that honestly was chock full of stinkers and disappointments, you're the one who made the mistake of stepping into my domain. I'm the hairiest Hare, and this is a very special Hare's Haunting Hour edition of Ranting Rabbit, a show where I reminisce and recollect on the remembrances of the revolting regions of time that came before. Today, I choose to point and throw curses in the direction of that time thankfully behind us. Tell me, dear viewer, do you remember it well? Do you remember when horror games were bad? The horror genre in gaming is overall a very delicate subject. The foundation was built long ago with titles like Texas Chainsaw, Friday the 13th, and other associated licensed tie-in games. Games like Castlevania and Maniac Mansion began to iterate on the macabre setting, yet still were missing that true element of fear. Eventually, games like Sweet Home, Clock Tower, and Phantasmagoria attempted an actual foray into the realm of genuine scares, yet it still lacked something. Players had access to frightful games, however, something which remained missing was player agency. A better connective tissue between the player and the protagonist. Perhaps technology was just not quite there yet. The essence of true fear in the landscape of video games wasn't truly captured until one game came along and completely changed the scene of horror and its potential in video games. Infogrames' Alone in the Dark released in 1992, and I'd be willing to bet the developers had no conceptual clue what they had just unknowingly unleashed onto the public. Because while Alone in the Dark is at times rudimentary in the landscape of our modern view, what it introduced ended up being the foundational inspirations for many games going forward. Games that would become the legendary deific properties that we associate with horror games to this day. Pre-rendered backgrounds with 3D characters, jump scares, booby traps, even 2 playable characters to choose from. All of these would be found in the Mac Daddy of horror games, the originator of the term survival horror, the 1996 classic Resident Evil. Resident Evil spread like a virus across the globe. By the time the calendar shifted over to December of 1997, in just 1 year, Resident Evil had sold more than 4 million copies worldwide, making it the highest-selling PlayStation game at the time. So on a sales level, Capcom had crushed it. They had put their foot in the door and quickly found another potential money-maker franchise. On a critical level, they had impressed even further. Outside of the glaringly poor voice acting and overall insanely paced story,
look at this. That's what I was going to say.
Resident Evil had been a beloved success. Horror games finally had found its footing, and from here, the possibilities were potentially endless. Within a short time, the horror genre sprouted legs and hit the ground running. In '98, Parasite Eve released with its more RPG-style gameplay and graphically horrifying cutscenes. Silent Hill in 1999 with its fog and considerably less forgiving combat and resource management. 1999's Nocturne. Resident Evil 2 in '98. Fear Effect. Dino Crisis. Evil Dead, Hail to the King, Dino Crisis 2, Silent Hill 2, Fatal Frame, Eternal Darkness, The Suffering, Obscure, BioShock, Dead Space. In the span of a few years, the horror genre went from being a few attempts here and there to being a consistently updated and overwhelmingly beloved top dog of the industry. By the time a young Hare rolled up to the party, the top dogs, the all-time favorites, had been solidified. However, I struggled to get through a session of Luigi's Mansion, so by the time I was ready to get a hit of the good stuff, I walked into a landscape of the horror genre that was far, far less impressive. I hear good things about that Silent Hill series. Maybe I should check it out, a naive little bunny boy said.
Good Lord, what is happening in there?
Okay. Maybe I should just head over to the slow burn horror franchise that's tried and true with its clunky controls and its meticulously placed fixed camera angles. Okay, well, Dead Space. You're more recent. You haven't had enough time to be yeah, maybe I'll come back around to this one. Whether you like these games or not, hopefully you're able to accept and realize that each of them are strange, malformed shadows of their former image. Resident Evil in the 7th generation found itself adopting qualities of its action-oriented 4th entry and relied so little on its horror elements that I'd struggle to call it a horror game. I'd more likely say it just has darker tones and a horror-adjacent setting. Meanwhile, Konami seemed to completely lose themselves for a period as they shipped Silent Hill overseas and hoped for the best. While it should be seen as a good thing, Silent Hill Homecoming received middling reception, that was honestly becoming such a strange industry norm.
Mid!
Every game was just kind of middle of the road, and so when Silent Hill published another title, Silent Hill Downpour, to mediocre reception, the Silent Hill name had begun to truly solidify itself as a mediocre and overall uninspired series, a far cry from its first two standout entries. Good news though, Konami has a little remaster for you so you can live out the glory years of yesterday, the Silent Hill HD Collection featuring Silent Hill 2 and 3, except by the time I look in its direction, all I heard were the complaints, technical faults, bizarrely worse fog in Silent Hill 2 revealing the game's scares and graphical limitations, and perhaps worst of them all, the changed voice acting that removed some of the uncanny experience from the game, something that would become a recognizable staple of the most celebrated horror game of all time.
Mary, could you really be in this town?
Mary, could you really be in this town?
Dead Space, on the other hand, had already slingshot itself into the realm of horror gaming with its first entry. However, the second rolled around, making itself a little more action while still retaining a lot of the scares. Despite the lean towards action, as was the style at the time, Dead Space 2 proved itself to be a beloved and celebrated all-timer. Then, that little two-letter logo rears its ugly head. Electronic Arts, the publisher and rights holder of Dead Space, was entering a particularly unsettling era of their existence, where they seemingly hated making video games and loved making money. So if you weren't an easily churnable sports game that could make some serious profit, you were likely under a delightfully delicious metaphorical sword of Damocles. Damocles? The sword of Damocles. Make a good game with good profits and EA might swoop up and purchase your developer studio. Then, while under their wing, EA will reasonably request a game from you. As your relationship continues, however, they'll make demands, changes, and overall mandate your game until it's a Frankenstein's monster of bad ideas with the intent of making a profit. When it inevitably fails, guess who gets the blame? Not the publisher, of course. EA sought to quickly wrap up the Dead Space trilogy so they could lean away from the horror elements, and frankly, it shows. Dead Space 3 is by far the least terrifying, and part of it is due to the strangely stapled on co-op system, as well as the narrative being a focus on quote-unquote save humanity rather than the previous game's focus on survival. Dead Space pitted you against monsters of unknown origin and behavior, taught you that all you had learned in your experiences with other games wasn't going to help you here, then stuck you in a derelict ship with the odds immensely stacked against you. By the time Dead Space 3's plot begins to roll out, that tension and dread is significantly reduced, again sucking that horror experience out of a franchise built with fear as its roots. This was unquestionably the trend of the time. Video games, through their many influences, are mirrors of their era, emblematic of so many elements surrounding them, and the world during the early stages of the 7th generation just liked seeing limbs fly, guts splayed. The world wanted explosions and gunfire. Even franchises that started in the 7th generation weren't immune to this effect. BioShock had the same exact process of going from a slow-paced scare fest to an action-filled shooting gallery. And right around the corner came the next massive explosion, whiplash, and horror games, the jump scare-filled YouTuber bait era, pioneered by games like Amnesia, Slender, and The 8 Pages, and of course, Five Nights at Freddy's. When I initially wrote the idea for this video many years ago, it was during a much darker era, one filled to bursting with these beloved YouTube clickbaits. Everywhere you look, that was the trend, and truthfully, my soul ached at the thought that horror games might well and truly be dead. After the poor reception to Resident Evil 6, the franchise went silent for nearly 5 years. Silent Hill farted out of Vita games, showed its immense potential with the PT demo, then that was all scrapped. Silent Hill went on the shelf all the way back in 2014, and we've only just now heard from them. There was an immense possibility that Silent Hill was just over and done. Dead Space similarly hit us with its third entry and then just put itself to bed in 2013. And with the closing of Visceral Games, Dead Space's developer studio, in 2017, it seemed assured that the franchise was well and truly laid to rest. In an incredibly optimistic turn of events, however, something has changed since then. Maybe it's those dedicated fans growing up to become developers themselves. Perhaps it's video game publishers rooting out their greediest of executives. Whatever it is, video games have entered an interesting new era of optimism that hadn't been present for many years. The entire industry has seen a profit from this shift. Independent games carry on the legacy of titles long forgotten. Sony funds huge single-player experiences completely devoid of predatory practices. Even fighting games are back and better than ever before. Head and shoulders above these, however, I think the horror genre has seen the most remarkable shift in a positive direction. The Resident Evil franchise saw an incredible return to form while still adding a layer of freshness by releasing Resident Evil 7. While its first-person perspective would have you believe it's the grandest departure possible from the days of old, the gameplay would assure you otherwise. RE7 is about as Resident Evil as it can get. Classic puzzles starting in an eerily large home, limited ammunition, and simple yet bombastic bosses to fight along the way. RE wasn't just back. Capcom kept the hits coming and so far hasn't let off the gas since. Meanwhile, across the way, after years of complete silence, Konami emerges from the fog with its own punch combination. Amongst them, Silent Hill returns. Not only is there a fresh new take on the series upcoming, but there's also the remake to the highly celebrated Silent Hill 2. While I personally don't have massive expectations for it, Konami has been adamant about assuring fans that the remake will be a faithful recreation to the 1999 experience with modern hardware, mechanics, and expectations. And even if you're like me and you're looking at this with a skeptical eye, you know what remake released and absolutely killed it in every aspect? The Dead Space remake, baby. It expanded areas, built on what came before, restructuring the old yet still staying faithful and respectful to what came before. Even if you aren't a fan of the classics, or even if you aren't a fan of the directions these franchises have gone, there's still so much out there for everyone. Those YouTuber clickbait games are still popping off all the time. The Action Fest games with macabre settings continue to release. And all the way on the flip side, if you're an old school survival horror faithful, the independent scene is still cranking out banger after banger with their own twists and iterations on the classic formula. No matter what way you look at it, we're all eating so freaking good. And how awesome is that? When I first penned this idea, I was younger, more cynical, and honestly afraid that this beloved side of the industry was going to shrivel up and die before I ever even got the chance to participate in it. Instead, just like the games, we survived. We made it out the other side of an era where horror games were bad, and managed to end up on the complete opposite side of reality. Horror games are killing it left and right. They're better than ever before, available for anyone to step in and get their nerves shot. And how awesome is that? Long live horror games. That's all I really wanted to get off my chest, and so, with that, I must return to my eternal slumber. Catch you in the shadows. Be excellent to each other.